Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We have not held a press conference on behalf of the Green Party and our parliamentary caucus in many weeks, and the schedule for press conferences has been quite overloaded, so I appreciate this opportunity to be here. We have never had there's not been a single day that Parliament has met in person that a member of the Green Party caucus has not been present. So we've been trading on and off. Jenica Atwin, Member of Parliament for Fredericton, Paul Manley, Member of Parliament for Nanaimo Ladysmith, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands. Je suis tellement heureuse d'être ici pour une conférence de presse parce qu'il y a très longtemps que le Parti vert n'a pas l'occasion pour parler avec les journalistes du Canada et pour rester ouvert pour les questions. Comme toujours, j'aime répondre aux questions. C'est tellement clair que la crise de COVID-19 continue. Nous ne sommes pas sortis de cette crise, mais c'est un moment de réfléchir sur le moment quand les règles strictes sont un peu relaxées. So we know it won't be too long before we see a relaxing of the rules around protecting ourselves in this pandemic. We are very clear as a party that public health rules are paramount. And there's been a conflict, sort of a friction I wanted to speak to first before opening to questions, between those in Parliament who want to reopen immediately, make sure we're meeting more frequently, having in-person question period, and those of us who think that public health advice must be observed. We believe as Greens that members of Parliament should model the kind of behavior we want to see that we're asking everyday Canadians to embark upon. If you're not doing essential work, stay home. That's still the best public health advice we have. Maintain distance. We like to call it physical distance as opposed to social distance because we want to stay socially connected. But in that friction, there have been questions about how well is Parliament functioning right now. Les questions fréquemment, je pense aux questions de comment on peut faire le Parlement du Canada maintenant dans une pandémie. Pour moi-même, je suis contente avec le niveau de participation pour les députés des partis verts, des partis en opposition. I think for the most part, our Parliament has been functioning extremely well, and I'll put it more firmly, our democracy has been functioning extremely well. Opposition members of Parliament are engaged in most files before firm decisions are made. And when a decision is announced that leaves many gaps, I would have to say that members of Parliament from all parties, including the Liberal Party, will speak up and say that wasn't good enough. There's a gap. We need to do more. So it's frustrating a bit when I think it's time for all hands on deck and no partisanship at all if possible, that the Conservatives typically claim credit that they stopped the government overreach in the first version of Bill C-13, which we saw on Sunday, March 22nd. They weren't alone in that. Every single opposition member that I heard on conference calls and in negotiations, whether they were Conservative or Bloc or New Democrat or Green, and again some Liberals, said this section that was in the first draft, Part 2, that allows the Minister of Finance and the Governor and Council to set tax rates, to change our taxation rules unilaterally. That's not acceptable. That wasn't the Conservatives alone going to the ramparts. It was everybody. And I think a fair assessment was drafting in a hurry, rushing, and of course we had to rush, leads to error. So that was a collective effort to change the legislation. We had two different drafts before we finally saw the final one in the wee hours of the morning of the 25th of March. But it was a collective effort, and I think evidence that democracy was working well, not the contrary. Again, I've heard the New Democrats take credit. We alone got the wage subsidy from 10% to 75%. I mean, they full marks for working hard on that, but so did the Greens. So did other parties. So did other members of Parliament. It's a sign of the times that the all-hands-on-deck approach in a pandemic is working remarkably well. We're also seeing real improvements in the technology that allows standing committees to meet. There are clearly limitations. The IT team of the House of Commons doesn't have the capacity for us to have all of the standing committees functioning at once. I wish it did. And if the pandemic were to continue or we were to have a second wave, I think we need investments to ensure that all standing committees can meet virtually, because that process works well. We can study, we can hear witnesses, we can make recommendations. That process, to my mind, is working well, as is the virtual question period, which is a very important point here. If we want to hold government to account, question period is the single most important way in our House of Commons that we do that. In the UK, it's Prime Minister's questions. It's a hallmark of Westminster parliamentary democracy, obviously not found in the United States and other places, that the Prime Minister and ministers of the Crown are available on a regular basis, predictably, to respond to questions. I won't say they answer questions every time, but they respond to questions, and it's a very important function. That function, I believe, should move to what the UK is now doing. It's called the hybrid model. I don't know how many Canadian journalists have looked at it, but unlike what we are doing now, where we have one day of virtual parliament, Tuesday, then a day of scaled back, very few people in the room, face-to-face parliament, Wednesday, and then everybody for COVID-19 committee again on a Thursday for virtual parliament. What the hybrid model does, and they're doing this in the UK, is that members of parliament who are physically in the room, in the chamber of Westminster, Palace of Westminster, participate equally and at the same time as members of parliament coming in by video. C'est une façon de travailler qui maintenant, c'est la façon de travail dont le Parlement de Westminster à Londres. C'est une décision du président de le Parlement à Londres qu'il y a un problème si on a un Parlement avec seulement un petit nombre de députés. C'est un problème pour les privilèges des députés. Chaque député a le droit de participer. Comment on peut continuer avec un Parlement en personne avec seulement 30 ou 35 députés pour les raisons pour protéger la santé, pas seulement des députés, mais la santé pour l'équipe, les travailleurs dans cet édifice? Alors, comment on peut continuer avec un choix qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a le droit de participer et les autres, non, pas possible. Dans le Parlement à Londres, tous les deux participaient simultanément en même temps. So to give you an example, and you can find a picture of this, there's a blog from the Member of Parliament from Bretton Pavilion, which is embedded in an article I wrote for Policy magazine recently on how virtual Parliament is working. And there's a photograph there where you can see that in the Parliament of Westminster, ministers are standing in person on the floor of the Parliament, very few of them. And my friend Carolyn Lucas, Member of Parliament for Bretton Pavilion, she's a Green, that's why we're in touch all the time, her face is enormous, asking a question from her home in Brighton of a minister on the floor. So this hybrid model, to my mind, meets some of the major challenges in terms of our parliamentary rules and procedures. À long terme, on doit continuer d'étudier la question des votes. Est-ce que c'est nécessaire d'avoir, comme maintenant dans le Parlement du Canada, c'est absolument obligatoire de redistribuer à chaque député son propre banquette pour le droit de voter? Ce n'est pas le cas maintenant à Londres, ni aux autres parlements. We have the most archaic voting system of any democracy I've been studying lately. I hadn't really thought about it before, but in Wales and in Scotland, there's electronic voting from the desk. That's easily transferable to voting from home. And in the Palace of Westminster, they don't have desks, and certainly with over 600 MPs and room for about half of that in the chamber, they vote by walking down the corridor on either side. So where we have the government lobby and the opposition lobby, they have corridors. And if you walk down the corridor on that side, you will remember the speaker saying, nay, yeah, Yeah. So, yes, you walk down one corridor to say nay, one corridor to say yay. And so it's recorded by a table officer on their iPad. So it's not public and it's recorded electronically. So I think we're going to have to make those next steps. I just wanted to share that from my point of view, public health advice is paramount. I think it's inappropriate for this Parliament to continue to sit face to face for purposes of question period alone. COVID-19 committee was created as a compromise to deal with the pressure from the Conservatives that we should meet face to face in the interests of democracy. I applaud Andrew Scheer's newfound interest in parliamentary democracy. I do not recall him protesting when Stephen Harper, in a minority parliament, prorogued and shut down Parliament during the 2008 financial crisis. I guess if you're a Conservative, the matter of holding the government to account matters whether you're government of the day or opposition of the day. But as Greens, both on the other side of the Atlantic and here, we believe that public health advice should be paramount and we should work virtually as much as possible. Thank you.
We'll now start the question period. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Comme d'habitude pour les questions, une question et une question suivie. We'll start with the question on the phone and then we'll turn to the room. Opérateur au téléphone. First question.
Thank you. Please press star one at this time if you have a question. Appuyez maintenant sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. Once again, please press star one if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant si vous avez une question.
We'll start in the room then, and then we'll turn back to the phone.
Julie Van Dusen, CBC. So I'm just wondering, with the energy sector being pummeled by what is going on in terms of, the demand for oil being down and so on. So do you foresee this as an opportunity for the green economy to take hold after this pandemic, and how would that work?
Yeah, it's a very critical question. Thank you, Julie. It's more than a question of an opportunity for green and renewable. It has to do with our ability as a global economy to recover. Yesterday, Shell Oil said that they didn't think oil was going to come back. That's a significant concession. It's a combination, as we know, and my heart bleeds for people who believe the sector is going to come back, because it's not. They've got, number one, we had Russia and Saudi Arabia colluding to make sure the price of oil dropped. Their goal there was to make unconventional oil, such as oil sands bitumen, but their target was more particularly back in shale, which has occupied so much of the U.S. market and led to the U.S. being far more energy secure and energy independent than they used to be. So Russia and Saudi Arabia were colluding to make the price drop to the bottom of the barrel, no pun intended. And then on top of that, unexpected, came a pandemic, which drove down demand for oil to unprecedented low levels, to where now the biggest problem in the oil sector is to find a place to store the oil for which there is no market. Even oil industry analysts looking at this are saying it's not going to come right back by any means. It will take years if it does come back. And in the meantime, the fierce competition is from renewable energy. And this is talking about the technology, the cost, the price point. So the recent review by the International Energy Agency found that every single energy source on the planet was taking a beating except renewable energy, which this year is increasing. In 2020, the renewable energy is going up by 5%. And by the end of this year, the International Energy Agency predicts that renewables will occupy a full 30% of generated electricity. So it's a big shift. At the same time, and I'm sorry, it's a longish answer, the global economy we are at a real risk of a very lengthy depression. We have to avoid that. That means we can't take the advice of people who say, for instance, you've spent enough money now, we're in debt, time to pay it back. We can't turn off the faucet. In other words, the only game in town for holding society together domestically and globally, is government spending. The private sector can't immediately pick up the slack after pandemic, and the oil sector isn't automatically going to, well, it's going to be years if it comes back, if at all. So it's very important that governments have incentives, put money into the economy, and do it in a way that builds on success, which is to say energy efficiency and renewables. And I'll stop there just to say there was a report that came out, I think 2 days ago, out of Oxford University. The two lead authors were Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and the former Chancellor of the Exchequer from the UK, Sir Nicholas Stern. They interviewed more than 200 central banks around the world and leading finance experts. And the advice is, if we want to get out of this pandemic with a healthy global economy, don't put money in fossil fuels at all to try to bail them out. It won't work. Put money into renewables and energy efficiency and a low carbon economy, because that's the only money that's going to actually be able to create a lot of jobs quickly and get the economy going again.
So basically you're saying oil is dead.
Oil is dead. And for people in the sector, it's very important that there be just transition funds, that there be strategies that go to every worker, every community. We've gone through this before, but on a smaller scale. When the government of Quebec decided asbestos is over. Now, that wasn't because they couldn't get price and they didn't have supply and they didn't have demand. It was because they finally faced the fact that it was killing people all around the world. We have, made government decisions. We've had bad management of resources that led to collapse. So 30,000 people lost work overnight in the early 90s when the cod stocks collapsed. And that was a predictable disaster, one that was ignored at the time by those who had the power to change things and keep the cod stocks going. But we do know, we've learned from bad examples of what you don't do to help communities when their resources have, through no fault of their own, come to an end. And diversifying the Alberta economy is enormously important. Groups like Iron and Earth, that's former oil sands workers who are now in renewable energy, are seeing the opportunities, and they're real life opportunities. There's no question but that the Alberta economy has to diversify, and the Canadian economy. We have a lot of our economy that's betting on exports of oil and exports of cars. And there's another whole wave about to hit us, not to be too depressing, but artificial intelligence is about to hit us, and driverless cars. And we have to be way ahead of the curve on this stuff. And the pandemic, in a very real way, as horrific as this is, at many, many levels, and primarily in the loss of human life, it gives us an opportunity to stop and think, how do we get this economy back up on its feet? It's not too early to be thinking about a conference on the scale of the post-war Bretton Woods conference. We need smart people globally to get together and say, are the tools we've been using since the end of the Second World War the right tools going forward? How do we maintain full employment, protect our people, get the economy going again in a context in which, this is another whole concern, the price of goods and the price of energy is going to continue to drop through things like AI, through things like the fact that solar energy and wind energy, once you install renewable energy, the marginal cost of energy is zero. So that a zero price world is not something we've ever dealt with before. So we really need to stop and think, how do we, as a country and as a society of nations, and I think starting very soon, start talking about, do the tools we have now and the tools we've used since the Second World War still work? And I really do think it's time for something like a Bretton Woods 2.
But when I said oil is dead, I was summarizing what you said. That wasn't my second question.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just, to clarify, what you're suggesting, I think, through all this is if anything pummeled oil more than anything, it's the pandemic. So, but that's not my question either. So my question is, which renewables would you focus on if you had the chance, if you were the government? So you're saying oil is dead. Mm-hmm. We can't kiss it goodbye. So which renewal, where do you want to, where's the focus?
I don't think the government should should try to choose which technologies it likes. I think it should put out requests for proposals, and we should absolutely, the federal government needs to play a role in infrastructure. We need a national electricity grid that works well. If you're looking at RFPs and saying we want renewable energy, we're looking at the lowest cost per kilowatt hour and the fastest installation. It's going to turn out to be solar, because solar right now, there's a big solar facility outside of it's southern Alberta. I think it's near Okotoks, but it came in at about 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So wind, solar, geothermal, district energy, and low run-of-the-river hydro, but no new dams. We don't need a single new dam to deal with this. And we certainly don't need to be cutting down trees and pretending that biomass is good electricity. Where there's a lot more to this, but I will stop.
Hi, Ms. May. Rachel Haynes from CTV National News. Just to follow up a little bit on what you're saying about renewables, but right now we are seeing a lot of plastics used, given the equipment that we have to use to be able to get through this crisis, given the swabs that are used throughout the testing, and obviously wanting to dispose as much as you can to get rid of germs. So how do you see this pandemic affecting the use of plastics in our country right now?
It's a very important question, and the rise in hospital facilities and healthcare as a sector being a very polluting sector is relatively recent. It can be tied to the cuts that happened to kill the deficit in the early 90s, where healthcare funding shrank, and a lot of hospitals got rid of permanent janitorial staff. So they had to move to more single-use items as a matter of being sure they had sterile equipment. I think we're going to be seeing perhaps a change. I'm already seeing hospitals talking about a can of PPE that is a gown be made to be washed and reused. In the meantime, I know from speaking with Minister Wilkinson, the intention is to continue, and I support the ban on single-use plastics that are non-essential, such as, the single-use plastic fork, the single-use plastic bag. For the healthcare industry, I think we need to actually look at what uses can be, what materials, what PPE can be designed for reuse, and what kinds of plastics are going to inevitably, and what kind of medical equipment is inevitably going to remain plastic, and how do we ensure that it doesn't end up in the oceans? Not to say we're banning all plastic. The ban on single-use plastic was never a ban on all plastic anyway. Plastic is an extremely useful product and can be quite durable in certain uses. It's the frivolous single-use items that need to be removed.
And a lot of what you're talking about in order to transition is probably something that is more likely to be done in the long term. But in the short term right now, people are losing jobs and they need support. One of the supports announced yesterday was support for the meat processing industry, which I believe you've been critical of in the past. But what do you do for these people and this industry that employs so many people across Canada and need help right now?
Number one, as you said, a lot of these are long term, but if we don't make the decisions in the short term, they simply won't happen. There's a very real risk of jumping the wrong way and hurting both our economy and climate action. But moving back to the question of agriculture, I've been critical of, and Greens are critical of the fact that our sector, our meat producing sector, is enormously vulnerable when we only have 3 major production facilities. We experienced this in 2012 when the XL beef plant experienced E. coli. There's another thing that we note about these large plants is that they're very dependent on temporary foreign workers. But where you find Canadians employed in this sector, it's in the producers. So the cattlemen's associations across the country are very active right now, as are those people producing other livestock. I think we should examine a number of models that we've assumed made sense in society. Large, globalized supply chains and concentrated production facilities. I think it's time for provincial departments of agriculture working with that sector to consider more of what we used to have, more decentralized, high quality, well maintained, regulated, and safe slaughterhouses and production facilities that are distributed more than 3 for all of Canada. I think it shows a vulnerability and the damage that can be done throughout the sector when one plant closes down, much less 2 plants. Consider this: 3 production facilities for beef for all of Canada. If you go back even 20 years, that wouldn't have been the case, and we did not have unsafe meat in our stores. I think we need to look at supply chains, look at more localization of production, and ensure that we have a system that works for the producers and the consumers.
We'll try on the phone once again. Opérateur au téléphone, is there any question?
Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant si vous avez une question.
Parfait.
There are no questions registered at this
Any
time.
question in the room?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I'll try to do shorter answers.
We've been talking a lot about leadership races in this country. The Green Party right now is undergoing a leadership race. A new candidate has been announced in the past week, Glenn Murray. So I'd just like an update on how this pandemic is affecting the leadership race for the Greens, and also if you have endorsed any of the candidates.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. First of all, the Federal Council of the Green Party, which is actually not only the governance structure, but controls party decision-making, and the leader doesn't have that kind of power. Sometimes I hear some of the candidates running for leadership saying, I'm going to take the party this direction. I think, boy, you ought to read the Constitution, because the leader doesn't get to do that. And as 13 years as leader, I know exactly what the job description of the leader of the Green Party of Canada is. In any case, given 13 years and the influence I would have, the council asked that I not endorse anyone. So I will not be endorsing any of the candidates. At this point, we have 3 approved candidates. The party has made some changes. I'm not on the leadership committee, but decisions have been taken to reduce the amount of money that was going to be required to be fully in the race. It was initially $50,000. The first tranche is $10,000. Excuse me. Not a COVID cough, just swallowed the wrong way. So given the difficulty of fundraising in a pandemic, it's now $10,000 by June 3rd and a second tranche of $20,000 by the end of the summer, for a total of $30,000. But it is hard for the candidates to fundraise during a pandemic. The party itself has significantly reduced fundraising efforts, recognizing that our members, as all Canadians, are struggling right now financially. It's not a great time to be sending out massive mailings asking for money. So the 3 approved candidates who have already made the first commitments and have been approved by a vetting process as approved candidates for the party, but they still have to come up with the second part of their money, is Annamie Paul, who's a Toronto lawyer and formerly diplomat with Foreign Affairs Canada. Amita Kuttner. Dr. Kuttner is a astrophysicist and ran in Burnaby. Annamie Paul ran in Toronto. And the third approved candidate is David Murner, who's a lawyer. He has experience working in PCO, experience working in government, and was the candidate in Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke, quite close to my riding. And as you mentioned, Glenn Murray, former Minister of Environment for the province of Ontario, former Mayor of Winnipeg, has thrown his hat in the ring with a lot of interest and excitement around that. We also have a number of candidates who've mentioned that they would like to run, but are not yet approved, at least 5 others. So it's looking to be a very interesting leadership race, a lot of diversity in the range of candidates in terms of racialized, non-binary. We have different candidates representing very different voices than we usually see in leadership races. I mean, we do see Leslie Lane in the Conservative race for leadership, and she's a Black woman. Annamie Paul is also a Black woman, and really they are making history, because the last time a Black woman ran for leader of a federal political party, it was Rosemary Brown for the NDP. It's been a long time, and this is very, very welcome. So I'm excited about it. At this point, they haven't changed the convention date. They're still planning for the first weekend of October in Charlottetown.
We'll have time for a last quick question.
Got a whole bunch, but I'll stick to one. So last week, the federal government announced help for Alberta, or maybe it was 10 days ago or something, cleaning up $1.7 billion, I think it was, for cleaning up orphaned and abandoned oil wells. The provincial government under Jason Kenney says, thanks very much, but it's not enough. Last week they said, look, we're desperate. We need help urgently. Justin Trudeau said a couple of days ago, we will be helping various sectors, including the energy sector. So considering you say oil is dead, what kind of help should they get?
Well, they are getting considerable help now. I mean, the corporations within the oil sector, like all businesses that meet the qualifications, get the 75% wage subsidy. That's a large benefit to an employer. They have access to funds for loans. They have access to help through BDC. There's also Western Diversification Office is going to be providing, and the details on this one we still don't have, but for smaller businesses that are falling between the cracks, one of my big concerns right now is small business that doesn't meet the wage subsidy rules, doesn't meet the CEBA rules for getting a loan. I'm very worried for small businesses across Canada. But the larger corporations can access a number of pockets. The money for targeted to orphan and abandoned wells not only helps in terms of creating jobs for workers in that sector in Alberta. There are, by the way, 100,000 orphaned wells in Alberta. This is a big job. And it's a toxic liability that affects the books of the province of Alberta. On the books, the Auditor General for Alberta has reported that it's in the billions of dollars as a liability. So it's assisting.
Jason Kenney says we need $30 billion.
I know. Jason Kenney may say that. I think it's astonishingly irresponsible for Jason Kenney to put money into the Keystone pipeline right now when there's no market for that, and it's still under challenge before the U.S. courts. I think that far too often, I heard a member of Parliament saying this yesterday in one of our standing committees, that Canada is showing itself not to be, actually it was a witness saying that we weren't good for, our global reputation was being tarnished because it was so hard to build a pipeline. The Keystone pipeline isn't built, and that's in the United States. It's approved, every inch of the Keystone pipeline is approved within Canada and not approved within the United States. So for Jason Kenney to put that much money into the Keystone pipeline while cutting healthcare in Alberta, I think I think the degree to which provinces are working well with the federal government, the degree of interprovincial and federal-provincial cooperation is to be celebrated. But I think on this, Jason Kenney couldn't be more wrong. It would damage our economy in Canada significantly to put money into a sector that can't come back. You need to put money into the sectors that have a real opportunity. There are disruptive technologies happening right now, just as disruptive to the horse and buggy, the way the Model T Ford was disruptive, just as much as Blockbuster Video thought it had a solid business proposition till Netflix came along. That's the kind of disruption we're seeing in the energy sector. And betting on Blockbuster Video right now would not be a good way to spend our money.
You didn't say how Trudeau should help them.
Well, I think the help is coming to workers, and we should continue to help workers, and we should help through the diversification of the Alberta economy. Alberta, of all the provinces in Canada, has hands down the best potential for solar energy. It has more sun. It could be producing a lot more solar. By the way, the abandoned and orphaned oil wells, about 10% of them, it's estimated, have the heat at depth to turn turbines to produce geothermal electricity. That's an enormously exciting opportunity, and one that might be taken up. Within the principles of UNDRIP, it's up to First Nations to express an interest if they're interested. But I know of one First Nation that already has taken over some orphan wells with the goal of producing renewable electricity from geothermal. And even those deep wells that don't have heat at depth to turn turbines have sufficient heat at depth to pre-warm water to ensure that there are greenhouses that have a source of heat to function 12 months of the year. So then of course there's, Alberta used to have a lot more dependency on agriculture, forestry. A lot of these are totally sustainable, but need to have a lot of planning in advance for adaptation to the level of climate change we can no longer avoid. Alberta is rich in resources and possibilities, and we will certainly be, and the Green Party's always been open to the idea that and actually favor the idea that we not use foreign oil while we're using Alberta oil and while it's available to us. That would mean that we don't believe we should be buying oil from Saudi Arabia. We don't think we should be having tanker loads of oil coming into East Coast Canada. We should be using the oil from Newfoundland for the East Coast of Canada instead of shipping it to the U.S. So our interlocked supply chains have not helped us have energy security in Canada or a domestic energy strategy. It's time to have that in place. But the idea that we have a product that the world wants, that idea is delusional.
That's all the time we had this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Merci
much.
beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you. The conference has now ended.
Merci beaucoup,
Please
tout le monde.
disconnect your lines at this time, and we thank you for your participation.